In the final days of June 2021, a wall of heat settled over the Pacific Northwest, and before it lifted, it killed hundreds of people. A village in Canada hit 121 degrees and burned to the ground the next day. Portland reached 116, a temperature that belongs in the desert, not in a city of evergreens and rain. Tonight, almost 5 years later, to the very week, the same atmospheric pattern that produced that catastrophe is rebuilding over the same ground, and forecasters are already saying records are likely. So is this weekend a faint repeat of that disaster, or a warning shot? And why does this exact machine keep coming back to this exact place? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. The warning that should not exist in June. On the night of June 11th, 2026, the National Weather Service office in Portland, Oregon did something it does not do lightly. It issued an extreme heat warning. Not an advisory, not a watch. A warning, the most serious product the agency has for heat, reserved for conditions it considers genuinely dangerous to human life. The warning called for temperatures between 95 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, beginning at 11 in the morning this coming Sunday and running all the way through 11 at night on Tuesday. And it was aimed at one of the last places in the United States you would expect to need it. The Pacific Northwest is not supposed to be a place that fears the heat. This is the country of evergreen forests and grey drizzle, of cool ocean air and summers so mild that, for generations, most people here never bothered to install air conditioning at all. It is a region whose entire identity is built around being the cool corner of the map. And yet here we are, in the middle of June, watching the most serious heat product the government issues get hung over Portland, over the Columbia River Gorge, over the suburbs of Vancouver, Washington, like a flag raised before a storm. That alone would be a story, but it is not the story. Because the truly unsettling thing about this weekend is not the number on the thermometer, it is the shape of the thing producing it. The atmospheric pattern now assembling over the western edge of the continent is not a new or random event. It is a familiar one. It has a name in the science, and it has a body count in the recent past. 5 years ago, almost to the week, this same machine switched on over this same ground, and by the time it switched off, hundreds of people were dead. That is the thread I want you to hold on to for the next couple of hours, because everything we are about to walk through connects back to it. The same pattern that killed hundreds of people in the Pacific Northwest in the summer of 2021 is rebuilding over the Pacific Northwest right now. The question is not simply how hot it will get this weekend. The question is whether we are watching a faint repeat of that catastrophe or a warning shot, and underneath that, a far larger question about why this particular pattern keeps coming back to the same place at the same time of year. Let me show you exactly what the forecasters are seeing, because the language they are using is telling. The Seattle office of the National Weather Service, in its discussion issued in the pre-dawn hours of June 12th, did not hedge. It described an upper-level ridge of high pressure building offshore and then sliding east directly over western Washington, and it used a phrase that meteorologists do not throw around casually. It said record highs were likely, not possible, likely. That is unusually confident language to use 2 and 3 days before an event, and it tells you the forecasters can already see the machinery locking into place. The numbers attached to that forecast are, on their surface, almost modest compared to what some parts of the country see every summer. Highs in the 80s across much of the Seattle area, lower 90s in the warmer inland valleys, 95 to 100 down in the Portland lowlands. If you live in Phoenix or Dallas, you might be tempted to shrug. People there see 100 degrees and barely look up from their coffee. But that comparison is a trap, and understanding why it is a trap is the first step to understanding why this story belongs on this channel at all. Heat is not an absolute. Heat is a relationship between a temperature and the body, the buildings, and the expectations of the people living underneath it. A city built for 115 degrees, full of air conditioning and shade and a population whose bodies have spent a lifetime adjusting to it, can absorb a brutal number and keep functioning. A city built for 75 degrees, where air conditioning is the exception rather than the rule, where the housing was designed to trap warmth through long, cool winters, and where it is still early in the season before anyone has acclimatized, can be brought to its knees by a number that sounds far less frightening on paper. The Pacific Northwest is the second kind of city, and this weekend the first kind of weather is coming for it. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, and it is worth saying why, because it is easy to assume that a heatwave is just weather, the province of the local forecast, not the sort of thing worth a serious investigation. But a heatwave is not really a weather story at all. It is a story about a machine in the upper atmosphere, about the behaviour of the jet stream that steers the weather of an entire hemisphere, about the changing baseline of the whole planet, and about the collision between an ancient planetary-scale physics and a modern population that built its cities on the assumption that this particular physics would never come for them. Look at it closely enough, and a heat wave becomes a window into how the atmosphere actually works, and into how the largest systems on Earth reach down and press on ordinary human lives. That is the territory we're in tonight. Not a forecast, but an investigation into a pattern, where it comes from, what it has already done, and why it will not stop coming back. And the reason it deserves that seriousness is sitting in the recent past, close enough to touch. The thing about the Pacific Northwest's gentle reputation is that it is a kind of memory, a story the region tells itself about what its weather is and always will be, and that memory is now actively dangerous because the atmosphere has stopped honouring it. The people most at ease, the ones who have lived here for decades and know in their bones that the summers are mild, are carrying a map of a climate that may no longer fully exist. When the same pattern that killed hundreds of people here in 2021 begins to reassemble, that comfortable memory becomes a liability, whispering that there is nothing to worry about at the exact moment the sky is preparing to prove otherwise. To understand why that whisper is wrong, we have to understand the machine itself. So what is actually happening up there in the atmosphere? Why does an upper-level ridge produce this kind of heat, and why is it forming here now, in a way that the people whose job it is to watch the sky are comparing quietly to one of the deadliest weather events in the modern history of this country? To answer that, we have to climb up off the surface of the planet and into the machinery itself, into the thing meteorologists call a heat dome. Because once you understand how that machine is built, you will never look at a quiet summer high-pressure system the same way again. And you will start to see why the forecasters use the word likely. Part 2. How a heat dome actually works. The term you've probably heard on the news is heat dome, and it is one of those rare pieces of weather jargon that is actually a pretty good description of the real thing. To understand it, we have to start with the part of the atmosphere most people never think about, the part thousands of feet over your head where the weather is actually steered. Up there, the air is organised into great rolling waves and ridges, like the surface of an ocean turned upside down, and the difference between a pleasant week and a deadly one often comes down to where one of those ridges decides to park. A ridge, in the simplest terms, is a dome of high pressure aloft. Picture the atmosphere as a fluid, because that is exactly what it is, and picture a region where that fluid bulges upward and outward, pressing down on everything beneath it. Under a strong ridge, the air is not rising, it is sinking. And this is the first secret of the heat dome, because sinking air does something that feels almost like a magic trick until you understand the physics. As air descends, it moves into the denser, higher pressure air closer to the ground, and that descending air gets compressed. When you compress a gas, you heat it. It is the same reason a bicycle pump gets warm in your hand as you force air into a tyre. The atmosphere is doing that to itself, on a scale of hundreds of miles, squeezing a column of sinking air until it warms by simply being pushed downward. This is what scientists call adiabatic warming, which is a fancy way of saying the air gets hotter without anyone adding heat to it. No new energy comes in from outside. The warmth comes purely from compression, from the act of sinking, and under a strong, stubborn ridge, that process runs hour after hour, day after day, building heat into the lower atmosphere and refusing to let it go. The same pattern that killed hundreds of people in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 was, at its core, exactly this, a column of air being relentlessly compressed from above. But the sinking is only half the story. The other half is what the ridge does to the sky itself. Sinking air suppresses the formation of clouds, because clouds need rising air to form. So under a heat dome, the sky tends to clear out and stay clear, which means the sun pours down day after day with nothing to block it. The ground bakes, the heat radiates back up, and because that descending air is acting like a lid pressed over a pot, the heat cannot escape upward the way it normally would. It gets trapped near the surface, and each day it builds on the heat left over from the day before. This is why heat domes get worse the longer they last. The system feeds on itself. Day 1 is hot, Day 3 is dangerous, Day 5 can be lethal. There is one more piece of the machinery worth dwelling on, because it explains why these systems are so maddeningly stubborn once they form. The sinking, warming air aloft creates what meteorologists call an inversion, a layer of warm air sitting on top of the cooler air near the surface. Normally, the atmosphere mixes vertically, with warm air rising and carrying heat away from the ground. But an inversion flips that arrangement and slams a cap on it. The warm layer aloft acts like a sealed lid on a pot, suppressing the rising motion that would otherwise vent the heat and prevent clouds and storms from breaking the pattern. Underneath that cap, the heat has nowhere to go but to build. And a strong ridge does something else that makes it hard to dislodge. It physically deflects the weather systems that might otherwise break it up, bending them around its edges the way a boulder in a river splits the current. Storms that could bring clouds, wind and relief get steered away to the north, or shunted around the flank of the dome, leaving the region underneath it baking in clear skies. The ridge defends its own existence. That is why these patterns, once locked in, tend to hold for days rather than hours. If you want proof that this machine is universal, and not some quirk of the Pacific Northwest, you only have to look at where it has struck before, on other continents, with devastating results. In the summer of 2003, a massive heat dome parked over Western Europe, a region with even less air conditioning than the Pacific Northwest, and an even more unsuspecting population. The result was one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern European history, with the death toll across the continent estimated in the tens of thousands, the hardest hit nation losing many thousands of mostly elderly citizens over a span of weeks. In the summer of 2010, the same kind of stubborn blocking ridge settled over Russia, sending temperatures in Moscow to levels never before recorded, igniting enormous wildfires and again killing tens of thousands. Go back to the summer of 1995 to Chicago, and you find a shorter but ferocious heatwave that killed several hundred people in just a few days, most of them elderly residents in UN-cooled apartments, in a tragedy that reads almost exactly like the playbook we have been describing. Different continents, different cities, the same machine. A ridge builds, the air sinks and warms, the lid traps it, the nights refuse to cool, and the vulnerable die. The same pattern now forming over the Pacific Northwest is a member of this same lethal family, and history makes very clear what this family is capable of when it finds an unprepared population. Meteorologists have another name for the specific shape this often takes, and it is worth knowing because you will hear it again. They call it an omega block. If you look at a weather map during one of these events and trace the path of the jet stream, the fast river of air that normally sweeps weather systems along from west to east, you will see it bend. Instead of flowing in a relatively straight line, it humps up and over the dome of high pressure in the shape of the Greek letter omega, that upside-down horseshoe. And the word block is the important one. A block, by definition, is stuck. It does not move along the way ordinary weather does. It sits, it parks, and everything underneath it is held hostage for as long as the block holds. That word stuck is the key to everything, and it is where this weekend story really lives. A hot afternoon is uncomfortable. A hot afternoon that repeats for 4 or 5 days in a row, each one a little hotter than the last with warm nights in between that never let anyone cool down, is a different kind of event entirely. It is the persistence that kills, not the peak. And the entire reason the same pattern that killed hundreds in 2021 is so feared is that, when it locks in, it does not let go on its own schedule. It lets go on the atmosphere's schedule, and the atmosphere is in no hurry. So now you understand the engine in general terms. A ridge builds, the air sinks, compression heats it, the sky clears, the sun pours in, the lid traps it, and a block holds the whole thing in place for days. That is the heat dome, anywhere it forms. But here is where the Pacific Northwest story turns from general physics into something specific and almost cruel, because the way this particular machine assembles over this particular coastline involves an extra ingredient, a trick of geography and wind that takes the region's single greatest natural defense against heat, the cool breath of the Pacific Ocean, and switches it off at exactly the wrong moment. To see that, we have to come back down to the surface and follow the wind. Part 3. The trick that switches off the ocean's air conditioning. If you have ever stood on a beach on the west coast on a hot day, and felt that cool, almost startling breeze coming in off the water, you have felt the Pacific Northwest's natural air conditioner at work. For most of the warm season, the prevailing flow along this coast comes in off the ocean. The Pacific is cold, even in summer, and the air that rides in off it is cool and moist. It forms what meteorologists call the marine layer, a shallow blanket of cool sea air that slides inland overnight and in the morning, pushing temperatures down, hanging grey clouds over the coast, and keeping the whole region livable. On a normal summer day, that ocean air is the reason Seattle and Portland stay comfortable, while the rest of the country swelters. It is the region's birthright, the thing that makes the climate what it is. This weekend, the atmosphere is going to take that birthright and turn it off. And the way it does so is the part of this story that the Seattle forecasters spelled out almost clinically in their discussion. They described a thermally induced surface trough moving up the coast, and they paired it with what they called low-level offshore flow. Those two phrases, buried in technical forecaster language, are the whole game. Let me translate them, because together they describe the precise mechanism by which the Pacific Northwest loses its defense against the very pattern that killed hundreds of people here 5 years ago. Start with the offshore flow. Most of the time, the wind near the surface blows onshore from the cool ocean toward the warm land. But under this developing ridge, the low-level winds reverse. Instead of blowing in from the sea, they blow out toward it, from the hot interior toward the coast. This is offshore flow, and it does two devastating things at once. First, it shuts off the supply of cool marine air. The ocean is still right there, still cold, but the wind is no longer carrying its breath inland. The air conditioner is unplugged. Second, and this is the truly punishing part, that offshore wind has to come down off the higher terrain to the east, down the slopes of the Cascades and the surrounding hills toward the lowlands. And we already know what happens when air sinks. It compresses, it heats. The very act of the wind descending toward the coast warms it further through the same adiabatic process we talked about in the dome above. So the region is hit twice, once by the loss of its cooling, and again by the heating of the wind that replaced it. It is worth picturing the actual geography of this, because the terrain of the Pacific Northwest turns a general principle into a specific weapon. To the east of the major population centres rise the Cascades and the foothills and high country beyond them. When the offshore flow sets up, air is drawn from that higher terrain downward toward the lowlands and the coast. As any parcel of air descends a mountain slope, it is compressed by the rising pressure, and it warms, often dramatically, a process you may have heard described in other regions by names like a foehn wind or a downslope wind. By the time the air arrives in the Willamette Valley around Portland, or spills into the Columbia Basin, or pools in the interior valleys of western Washington, it has been heated twice over, first by the descent off the high country, and then by the broader compression under the dome. These basins and valleys are bowls that trap the heated air, and they are precisely where the cities sit. The very landform that makes the Pacific Northwest beautiful, the ring of mountains around fertile lowlands, becomes, under this specific wind pattern, a set of basins that concentrate and bake. There is a second danger that rides along with this offshore downslope flow, and it is one this region knows to fear. The same descending wind that heats the lowlands is also a dry wind, with its moisture wrung out and its relative humidity driven down. Hot, dry and breezy is the exact recipe for extreme fire weather, and it is no accident that severe heat events in the West so often arrive hand in hand with elevated fire danger and red flag warnings. The story of Lytton in 2021, the village that recorded the hottest temperature in Canadian history and then burned to the ground the very next day, is the clearest possible illustration of how the heat and the fire risk are two faces of the same atmospheric pattern. The same machine that threatens the Pacific Northwest with record heat this weekend is, in the background, also priming the land to burn. The dome does not bring just one hazard. It brings a package of them, all driven by the same sinking, drying, compressing air. Then there is the thermally induced trough. As the interior of the Pacific Northwest heats up under the ridge, the hot air near the surface expands and rises slightly, lowering the surface pressure inland and along the coast. This forms a shallow, low-pressure trough, and the position of that trough is what steers the offshore wind and locks the warm pattern in place. When the forecasters wrote that this trough, combined with the offshore flow, would produce record-high temperatures, they were describing the exact moment the machine completes itself. The dome aloft compresses the air from above. The offshore wind erases the ocean's cooling and adds its own compression from the side, and the trough holds the configuration steady. every piece reinforces every other piece. The same pattern that killed hundreds in 2021 is not one thing going wrong. It is several things going wrong together, in concert, each one amplifying the next. There is a cruel geography to who gets hit and who is spared, and it is worth understanding because it shapes where the danger concentrates. The immediate coastline, right at the water's edge, often escapes the worst of it. Even under offshore flow, an afternoon sea breeze can sometimes sneak back in along the beaches, capping the temperatures right at the shore in the 70s. The forecasters noted exactly this. The real heat does not pile up at the coast. It piles up inland, in the interior valleys, in the Portland metro lowlands, in the Willamette and the Columbia basins, in the very places where the most people live. The population centers are precisely where the dome, the offshore wind, and the trapped air converge most fiercely. This is not heat spread thin across empty country. It is heat concentrated over cities. And the cities are where this stops being a physics lecture and starts being a human one. Because a number like 100 degrees does not mean the same thing everywhere. It lands on a place. It lands on its buildings, its power grid, its hospitals, and most of all on the bodies of the people who live there. The same temperature that a desert city absorbs without blinking can overwhelm a region that was never built for it, never adapted to it, and never expected it. The Pacific Northwest is exactly that kind of region, and to understand why this weekend's pattern frightens the people who study it, we have to look closely at just how uniquely unprepared this corner of the country is for the one kind of weather now bearing down on it. We have to look at why, of all the places on the map, this is the worst possible place for this particular machine to switch on. Part 4. The most unprepared region. In America. There is a statistic that explains the Pacific Northwest vulnerability better than almost any other, and it has nothing to do with temperature. It has to do with air conditioning. For most of the country, an air conditioner is simply assumed, as ordinary as a refrigerator. In the South, in the Southwest, in most of the middle of the country, you would no more build a home without cooling than you would build it without a roof. But in Seattle and Portland, for most of their modern history, air conditioning was treated as an exotic luxury, a thing you might find in an office tower or a movie theatre, but not in an ordinary house. Why would you install it? The summers were short and mild, the nights were cool, the ocean did the cooling for free. Generations of homes were built on the assumption that the climate would handle it. That assumption is now a liability, and it is baked into the physical fabric of millions of buildings. When the heat dome locks in, and the ocean's air conditioning switches off, a huge share of the population has no second line of defence. They cannot simply close the windows and turn a dial. The homes themselves were designed for the opposite problem. They were built to hold warmth in through long, damp, chilly winters, with insulation and construction meant to trap heat, not shed it. Under a heat dome, that same design becomes a trap in the literal sense. The house absorbs the day's heat and holds on to it, and without cooling, the interior can climb to temperatures higher than the air outside and stay there long after sunset. The very engineering that makes a Northwest home cozy in February makes it a slow oven in a June heat wave, and this is the core of why the same pattern that killed hundreds of people here in 2021 is so much more dangerous in this region than the raw numbers suggest. It is not that 100 degrees is hotter in Portland than it is in Phoenix. It is the same 100 degrees. It is that 100 degrees arrives in Portland with none of the defences that Phoenix has spent decades building. No widespread cooling, housing designed to hold heat, and a population whose bodies are not ready. That last point, the body's own readiness, is one most people never think about, and it matters enormously. Human beings acclimatise to heat. It is a real, measurable physiological process. When you're exposed to heat gradually over a period of 1 to 2 weeks, your body adapts. You begin to sweat sooner and more efficiently, your blood plasma volume increases, your cardiovascular system does not have to work as hard to move heat to the skin, and your tolerance climbs significantly. This is why the first heat wave of the season is consistently the deadliest one, far more dangerous than an identical temperature in late August. By August, bodies have been seasoned by a summer of warmth. In the middle of June, they have not. This weekend's event arrives early, before anyone in the Pacific Northwest has had the chance to adjust, hitting a population at its least prepared moment in the entire year. Let me put some hard numbers on the air conditioning problem, because it is the single clearest measure of the region's exposure. For most of the recent past, the Seattle metropolitan area held the distinction of being the least air-conditioned major metro in the entire United States. Historically, only around a third to a little under half of homes in the Seattle area had any form of air conditioning at all, a figure that would be almost unthinkable in a southern city where the number approaches 100%. Portland sat in a similar position, near the bottom of the national rankings. This was never an oversight. It was a rational response to a climate that, for generations, genuinely did not require cooling. Why spend money to install and run a machine you might need for only a handful of days a year? The math made sense, right up until the climate began handing the region events that the math never accounted for. The catastrophe of 2021 changed that calculation, and there has been a real scramble in the years since to install cooling, with air conditioning adoption climbing meaningfully across the region. That is genuine progress, and it means this weekend's event meets a population somewhat better defended than the one caught flat-footed 5 years ago. But the gap closes slowly. Air conditioning is expensive to install, especially in older homes that were never wired or designed for it, and the people least likely to have added it are precisely the most vulnerable, the elderly on fixed incomes, renters who cannot modify their units, low-income households for whom the upfront cost is simply out of reach. So even as the regional average improves, the protection is distributed unevenly, concentrated among those who could afford it and thinnest exactly where the risk is highest. Then there is the housing itself, the physical building stock, which carries the assumptions of the old climate baked into its bones. A home built to hold heat through a long, damp, chilly winter is a home that fights you when you try to cool it in summer. Many older Northwest homes have limited cross-ventilation, windows that were never meant to dump heat efficiently, and construction that holds warmth by design. Apartment units on upper floors, where heat rises and collects, can become genuinely dangerous spaces during a multi-day event, climbing well above the outdoor temperature and staying there through the night. This is the same factor that turned so many homes into traps in 2021, and it is structural, not behavioral. You cannot fix a building's thermal design with a public service announcement. The region is, quite literally, built for a climate that the same pattern forming this weekend no longer reliably respects. Layer these factors together and you begin to see why the forecasters reach for comparisons to a disaster. A region with little air conditioning, homes built to trap heat, a population not yet acclimatized, a culture that, understandably, does not take heat seriously because for most of living memory it never had to. Many people in the Northwest have spent their whole lives being told correctly that their summers are gentle, that cultural memory is itself a danger, because it leads people to underestimate exactly the kind of event now forming. The person who has lived in Portland for 40 years and never once needed air conditioning is, paradoxically, more at risk than a newcomer from Texas, because experience is telling them this is nothing to worry about. There is also the simple matter of scale and surprise. When a heat wave hits a region that expects it, the response is automatic. Cooling centers are standard. Emergency plans are practiced. The public knows the drill. When a heat wave of this severity hits a region that does not expect it, every one of those systems has to be improvised in real time, often faster than a slow-moving population can respond. Outreach to vulnerable people, the elderly living alone, those without transportation, those who cannot afford to cool even one room, becomes a frantic race. And the people most at risk are very often the ones hardest to reach. I want to be careful and honest here, because this matters, and because the goal is never to manufacture fear. On the current forecast, this weekend's event is not expected to reach the monstrous extremes of 2021. We are talking about temperatures in the 90s to around 100 degrees, not the staggering 116 degrees that Portland recorded at the peak of that catastrophe. The danger this weekend is real but more conventional. It is the danger of a serious early-season heatwave landing on the single, most underprepared major population for exactly this kind of weather in the entire country. That is enough. It does not need to match 2021 to be lethal. The same pattern, even in a milder form, finds the same weaknesses. And there is one weakness that towers above all the others, one factor that, more than the daytime highs, more than the air conditioning, more than anything else, determines whether a heat wave merely makes people miserable or actually starts killing them. It is not what happens during the day, it is what happens at night. Because the human body has a way of surviving brutal heat, of enduring it and recovering, but that survival depends entirely on one thing the heat dome is specifically designed to take away: To understand the real killer in this weekend's forecast, we have to talk about the night that refuses to cool. Part 5. The night that refuses to cool. Here is the most important number in this entire forecast, and it is one that almost never makes the headlines. The Seattle forecasters noted that on the warmest night of this event, overnight low temperatures in the metro area would not fall below 60 degrees. They would stay above it. To most people, that sounds almost pleasant. 60 degrees is a mild night. Why would that be the dangerous part? The answer is one of the most important and least understood facts about how heat actually kills, and once you understand it, you will never look at an overnight low the same way again. The human body deals with heat by shedding it. All day long, in hot conditions, your body is fighting to push its internal temperature back down, mainly by sweating and by moving warm blood to the surface of the skin where it can release heat into the air. This is hard work for the body. It strains the cardiovascular system, which has to pump faster and harder. It drains fluids and salts. It is survivable, but it is exhausting, and it cannot continue indefinitely. The body needs a chance to recover, and that chance comes at night. When the sun goes down and the air cools, the body finally wins the battle. It releases the accumulated heat of the day, the pulse settles, the core temperature drops back to normal, and the system resets, ready to face the next day. Now take that recovery away. When the nighttime temperature stays high, when it never drops below the 70s or even the 60s in a home with no air conditioning that has been baking all day, the body never gets its reset. The core temperature, instead of falling back to safe levels overnight, starts the next day already elevated, and then the sun comes up and the heat builds again, on top of a body that never recovered from yesterday. Do that for one night and you are tired. Do it for 3 or 4 nights in a row, which is exactly what a multi-day heat dome delivers, and the body's ability to cope erodes night by night until, in the most vulnerable people, it simply fails. The medical term is heat stress, and it cascades. The cardiovascular system, already strained, is pushed past its limit. This is why the overwhelming majority of heatwave deaths are not people collapsing in the blazing afternoon sun. They are people dying quietly, often at night, often alone, in homes that never cooled down after several days of a body that could never catch its breath. It is worth understanding exactly what is happening inside the body when heat wins, because the progression has a grim and specific logic. The first stage is what is called heat exhaustion, and it is the body's warning that it is losing the fight. The signs are heavy sweating, weakness, dizziness, nausea, a fast and weak pulse, cool and clammy skin. At this stage, the body is still trying, still sweating, still moving blood to the surface, but it is falling behind. If the person can get to a cooler place, rehydrate, and rest, they can recover. But if the heat keeps winning, the body crosses a threshold into the far more dangerous condition called heat stroke, and this is the one that kills. Heat stroke is generally defined by a core body temperature climbing past about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and at that point the body's ability to regulate its own temperature breaks down entirely. The sweating may actually stop, the skin can turn hot and dry, and the soaring internal temperature begins to damage the brain, the kidneys, and other organs directly. Confusion, disorientation, and loss of consciousness follow. Without rapid cooling and medical care, heat stroke is frequently fatal. This is the cliff that the warm nights push the most vulnerable toward, a little further each day. The reason some people are so much more exposed comes down to the machinery of temperature regulation, and to who has the least of it in reserve. The elderly are at the top of the risk list for concrete physiological reasons. As the body ages, it becomes less efficient at sensing heat, less efficient at sweating, and slower to move blood to the skin, so an older person can be dangerously overheating without even feeling especially hot or thirsty. Their margin is simply thinner. Certain very common medications add to the danger in ways most people never consider. Some cardiac and blood pressure drugs interfere with the body's ability to circulate heat to the surface or to maintain hydration. Diuretics, often called water pills, deplete the fluids and salts that sweating already drains. Certain medications for mental health can disrupt the brain's temperature regulation directly. None of this is the patient's fault, and most have no idea their prescription has quietly lowered their heat tolerance. Add chronic conditions like cardiac disease, lung disease, diabetes, and kidney disease, each of which leaves less reserve to spend on fighting heat, and you have a population for whom the same temperature that merely annoys a healthy adult can be genuinely life-threatening. The same pattern that is forming this weekend does not threaten everyone equally. It searches out these specific vulnerabilities, and it presses on them night after night until the thinnest margins give way. This is the mechanism that makes the persistence of a heat dome so lethal, and it ties directly back to the machine we built in the earlier parts. Remember that the dome traps heat near the surface and refuses to let it radiate away. That trapping does not stop at sunset. The lid is still there at night. The accumulated warmth in the ground and in the buildings has nowhere to go, and so the nighttime low, the body's one lifeline, gets stolen. The same pattern that killed hundreds of people in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 did most of its killing precisely this way, through warm nights stacked one on top of another until the most fragile bodies gave out. The daytime numbers got the headlines. The nighttime numbers did the damage. There is a cruel mathematics to who is most exposed. The people most likely to die in a heat wave are not, for the most part, the young and healthy. They are the elderly, whose bodies regulate temperature less effectively and whose hearts have less reserve to spare. They are people with chronic illnesses, cardiac disease, lung disease, kidney disease, the conditions that heat stress pushes over the edge. They are people on certain medications that interfere with the body's ability to regulate heat or stay hydrated. They are people living alone who have no one to notice when they start to fade. And they are the poor, who cannot afford to run cooling even if they have it, who may be afraid of the electric bill, who live in the hottest and least insulated housing. A heat wave is, in the most literal sense, an event that finds a society's most vulnerable people and applies pressure to them until the weakest links break, and it does this silently. This is part of what makes heat such an underestimated killer. A hurricane announces itself. A wildfire throws up a wall of smoke you can see from space. A flood leaves a visible scar across the land. Heat does none of that. It kills invisibly, indoors, one fragile body at a time, and the bodies are often not even counted as heat deaths in the immediate aftermath because the proximate cause looks like a cardiac event or organ failure. It is only later, when statisticians compare the number of people who died that week to the number who would normally die, that the true toll of a major heatwave emerges, often far higher than the early counts suggested. Heat is the deadliest form of weather in the United States in an average year, deadlier than hurricanes, deadlier than tornadoes, deadlier than floods, and it earns that title precisely because it is so quiet that people refuse to take it seriously until it is too late. So when you hear that this weekend's overnight lows will stay above 60 degrees, do not file it away as the mild part of the forecast. It is the part that the people who study this fear most. It is the signature of a pattern that does not just make an afternoon hot, but denies a population its nightly recovery for days in a row, in homes that cannot cool. That is the same mechanism that turned the summer of 2021 into a mass casualty event. The question now becomes what this does to everything we have built on top of this assumption of mild weather, to the power grid, to the hospitals, to the whole interlocking machine of a modern region that was engineered for a climate that may no longer reliably show up. Because when the heat lands, it does not stop at the human body. It reaches into the infrastructure, and that is where a heat wave can begin to cascade. Part 6. The grid, the hospitals, and the cascade. A modern city is a machine for keeping people alive, and like any machine, it has tolerances, limits beyond which its parts begin to fail. Under ordinary conditions, you never see those limits. The power flows, the water runs, the hospitals have beds, and the whole apparatus hums along invisibly. A severe persistent heat wave is one of the few events that can press a city against all of its tolerances at once, and the way those systems interact under that pressure is where an uncomfortable weekend can tip into something genuinely dangerous. The same pattern that killed hundreds of people in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 did not act on bodies alone. It acted on the systems those bodies depend on. Start with the power grid, because it sits at the center of everything. During a heat wave, electricity demand spikes as everyone who does have air conditioning runs it at maximum, often around the clock, and in a region where cooling is becoming more common after the shock of recent years, that surge can be steep and sudden. But here is the dangerous feedback loop. The same heat that drives demand up also makes the grid less able to supply it. Power lines sag and lose capacity in extreme heat. Transformers and other equipment run hotter and are more prone to failure. generating equipment can lose efficiency. So at the exact moment when demand is highest, the system's ability to deliver is at its weakest. If something gives way, if a piece of equipment fails or demand simply exceeds supply, the result can be exactly what you least want in a heatwave, a power outage. And a power outage during a heat dome is not an inconvenience. It is the removal of the one thing keeping the people who do have cooling alive. The air conditioning stops, the homes begin to heat, and the most vulnerable people, who are relying on that cooling, are suddenly exposed. The 2021 event left a vivid record of just how literally a region's infrastructure can come apart under heat it was never built for, and those images are worth holding in mind because they make the abstraction concrete. Roads buckled. The heat caused pavement on highways and interstates to expand, crack and heave upward, opening fissures and lifting slabs of concrete in a way that damaged vehicles and forced closures. In Portland, the overhead power cables that run the streetcar system melted in the heat, shutting the service down, and the regional light rail had to slow or suspend operations out of fear that the heat would warp the steel rails themselves. Cooling centres overflowed. Businesses closed because their workers could not safely operate, and their buildings could not be kept livable. Hospitals reported surges of heat-related illness that strained their capacity. None of this was a movie. It was an ordinary American region discovering in real time that the physical systems it depended on had tolerances, and that a sufficiently extreme heat event could exceed them across the board, all at once. The grid story in particular deserves a closer look, because it sits at the centre of the cascade and because the physics of it is genuinely counterintuitive. Most people assume that on a hot day the only problem is that everyone turns on the air conditioning at once, driving demand through the roof. That is half of it. But the heat also attacks the supply side simultaneously. Electrical transmission lines actually carry less power when they are hot, because the metal expands and sags, and the system has to be derated to keep the lines from drooping into danger. Transformers and substations, the workhorses of the grid, run hotter and are more likely to fail under sustained extreme temperatures, and they have less ability to shed their own heat when the surrounding air is already scorching. Even some forms of generation lose efficiency in extreme heat, so the demand curve and the supply curve move in exactly the wrong directions at the same moment, demand spiking up while capacity sags down, and the gap between them is where blackouts are born. And a blackout in the middle of a heat dome is the single most dangerous failure on the list, because it removes the one thing keeping the protected population alive. The same pattern that strains the body and floods the hospitals also leans, at that very moment, on the power grid that everything else depends on. The water system feels it too. Demand for water climbs as people drink more, as they try to cool themselves, as they water gardens and crops desperate against the heat. Pumping that water takes electricity, tying the water system's fate to the same straining grid. And in a region where the warm season is also, increasingly, a dry season, the stress on water supply during an extended heat event compounds quietly in the background. Then there is the medical system, and this is where the human toll and the infrastructure toll meet. As a heat wave wears on and bodies begin to fail, emergency calls climb. Ambulances run more often. Emergency rooms fill with cases of heat exhaustion and heat stroke, with cardiac events triggered by the strain, with vulnerable patients whose chronic conditions have been pushed over the edge. A hospital system has a finite number of beds, a finite number of staff, a finite capacity. A severe multi-day heatwave can push that capacity hard, and a system already running near its limits has little slack to absorb a surge. The people staffing those hospitals are themselves working through the same brutal conditions. The strain is everywhere at once. What makes all of this genuinely hazardous is the way the failures can link together, each one making the next more likely. This is what engineers call a cascade. The heat drives power demand up. The heat weakens the grid fails somewhere. The outage knocks out cooling, which sends more people into medical crisis, which strains the hospitals, which are themselves dependent on the same power. Each system leans on the others, and when one buckles, it shifts weight onto the rest. The reason emergency managers lose sleep over heat domes is not any single failure. It is the possibility of several failures arriving together and reinforcing each other, the way the dome and the offshore wind and the trough reinforce each other in the sky above. The pattern that threatens the Pacific Northwest this weekend is dangerous precisely because it stresses the body and the grid and the hospital all at the same time, through the same persistent heat for days on end. Now, I want to keep this grounded because the goal here is understanding, not panic. On the current forecast, this weekend is not expected to be a grid-breaking, hospital-overwhelming catastrophe on the scale of the worst case. It is expected to be a serious, dangerous heat event that will test these systems, send the vulnerable into real risk, and demand a real response. The point of walking through the cascade is not to predict collapse. It is to show you why a number like 100 degrees, in a region built for 75, is treated by the people whose job it is to keep that region alive as something to be taken seriously rather than shrugged off. The systems have more slack than they did a few years ago because the shock of recent events forced changes, but the fundamental vulnerability, the mismatch between what the region was built for and what the atmosphere is now delivering, has not gone away. It is worth naming plainly what separates a difficult weekend from a true catastrophe, because the difference is mostly a matter of degree, not of kind. The same chain of failures we just walked through, demand spiking, the grid sagging, an outage hitting, cooling vanishing, hospitals filling, exist on a sliding scale. A moderate event tests the chain, and the chain holds, bent but unbroken. A monstrous event, like the one this region saw 5 years ago, pushes every link at once until some of them give. This weekend, on the forecast as it stands, lands closer to the first case than the second. The chain will be tested, the vulnerable will be at real risk, cooling centres will matter, outreach will matter, and the grid will be watched closely. But the catastrophic, every system failing together scenario is not the expected outcome this time. The point of understanding the cascade is not to predict that it will happen this weekend. It is to understand why the people who manage these systems treat even a moderate heat dome with such seriousness, because they know the chain is the same one, and they know exactly how it breaks when the pattern runs hot enough. And that mismatch is the thread that runs through everything we have covered so far. A machine in the sky that compresses and traps heat. A region uniquely unprepared to absorb it. Bodies denied their nightly recovery. Infrastructure pressed against its limits. All of it driven by a single stubborn parked ridge of high pressure that the forecasters can already see locking into place. The natural question now is the practical one. When, exactly, does this hit? How does the weekend actually unfold, hour by hour, and what should the people in its path be watching for as the pattern reaches its peak? Let me walk you through the timeline, because the shape of this event over the next several days tells its own story. Part 7. The weekend, hour by hour. Every heat dome has a life cycle, a beginning, a peak, and an end. And reading that life cycle in advance is exactly what the forecasters are doing when they write their discussions. For this event, the story begins not on the hottest day but a couple of days before, with the ridge of high pressure building well offshore, out over the Pacific, its axis sitting far to the west. On Saturday, the machine is still loading. The ridge is strengthening and beginning its slide toward the coast, and temperatures across the Pacific Northwest are already warming, but the worst is held back. Saturday is the deceptive day, the one where it is warm and pleasant and the danger still feels theoretical. It is the calm before the lid comes down. The turn comes as the ridge moves inland over western Washington, and the offshore flow sets up. By Sunday, the configuration is complete. This is when the Seattle office expects record highs to begin falling, and when the Portland extreme heat warning takes effect, starting at 11 in the morning. Sunday is the day the heat goes from uncomfortable to dangerous, the day the numbers climb into the 90s across the interior and toward 100 degrees in the Portland lowlands. And critically, Sunday night is the first of the warm nights, the first time the body is denied its recovery. The danger does not peak on Sunday. It begins to accumulate on Sunday. Monday, by most indications, is the worst day, and there is a specific reason for that. As the thermally induced trough shifts inland, the heat reaches its maximum, and Monday night is the night the forecasters flagged for those overnight lows staying above 60 degrees in the Seattle metro. Remember everything we said about the night that refuses to cool. By Monday, the population has already endured the heat of Sunday and a warm Sunday night. Their bodies are starting the day behind. Then Monday delivers the peak, and Monday night refuses to let them recover yet again. This is the hinge of the entire event, the point of maximum strain, when several days of accumulated heat, denied recovery and infrastructure stress all converge. If anything is going to break, it breaks around here. It is worth being clear about what it actually means for the forecasters to say records are likely, because the bar is higher than it sounds. A record high for a given date is the hottest that date has ever been at that location across the entire history of measurement, often well over a century of daily readings. To say a record is likely is to say that out of more than 100 years of that calendar day, this particular version is expected to be the hottest one ever observed. That is not a routine forecast. Forecasters do not reach for that language casually, and the fact that the Seattle office did 2 and 3 days out tells you the signal in the models was strong and consistent. The same confidence, applied to a far more extreme event, is exactly what preceded the disaster of 2021, which is part of why the word carries the weight it does this time. There is also a subtle danger in how the event ends, and it is worth flagging. When the ridge finally weakens and the marine air begins to return by the middle of next week, the relief is real, but it is not instant and it is not uniform. The immediate coast feels the ocean's return first. The interior valleys, the very basins where the heat concentrated most, are the last to let go, sometimes holding their warmth for a full extra day after the coast has cooled. And there is a documented pattern in heat events, where people relax their guard as soon as they hear that cooler weather is coming. Even though the final day of a heat dome can still be dangerous, landing on bodies that have already endured several days of strain. The end of a heat wave is not a clean switch. It is a slow release, and the most worn-down bodies are still at risk right up until the marine layer fully reclaims the interior. The same pattern that takes days to build also takes its time letting go, and that long tail is part of what makes it dangerous. Tuesday is when the system finally begins to loosen its grip, though loosen is a relative word. The Portland warning runs through 11 at night on Tuesday, which tells you the forecasters expect dangerous conditions to persist right through that day before the pattern starts to break down. As the ridge weakens and shifts, onshore flow can begin to return, the ocean's air conditioning slowly reconnects, and the marine layer starts to creep back inland. But the relief arrives gradually, not all at once, and the interior valleys are the last to feel it. By the middle of the week, the cooling trend should be underway, the block finally yielding and the region exhaling. The machine, having held for the better part of 4 days, lets go. That 4-day window, roughly Sunday through Tuesday at its core, is the entire danger zone, and the shape of it matters as much as the peak temperature. A single 100-degree afternoon, followed by a cool night, would be a footnote. This is not that. This is a multi-day siege, with each hot day building on the last and each warm night stealing the recovery in between. It is the duration, the relentlessness, that defines the threat, and it is exactly the signature of the same kind of pattern that produced the disaster of 2021. The block holds, and everything underneath it has to endure for as long as the block holds. For the people in its path, the practical signals to watch are clear and worth stating plainly, because this is a channel about understanding what the sky is doing, and understanding should translate into awareness. Watch the overnight lows as closely as the daytime highs, because the warm nights are the real measure of danger. Watch whether the forecast records actually fall, because that confirms the machine has fully locked in. Pay attention to the interior valleys rather than the immediate coast, because that is where the heat will concentrate, and keep an eye on the grid, because the cascade we walked through begins with electricity. The official guidance from the agencies that issue these warnings, the National Weather Service, local emergency management, is always the authority for what to actually do. The job here is to help you understand why they are saying it. So that is the anatomy of the weekend ahead, a ridge building offshore, sliding inland, locking in for 4 days, peaking Monday, and finally breaking by midweek, with the worst danger hidden not in the afternoon peaks, but in the nights that never cool. It is a complete portrait of a heat dome doing what heat domes do. But a portrait of this weekend alone would be missing the thing that makes it genuinely chilling, the thing that has the forecasters reaching for comparisons, and that gave this video its title. Because we have seen this exact machine before. We have seen it assemble over this exact region, in this exact stretch of the calendar, and we have watched what it can do when it reaches its full and terrible potential. To understand what this weekend could be, and to understand why the pattern itself is the real story, we have to go back 5 years, to the summer the Pacific Northwest learned what its sky was capable of. Part 8. 5 years ago, the same sky. In the final days of June 2021, The people of the Pacific Northwest were living their normal lives in a region famous for never needing to worry much about heat, when the atmosphere did something that, by the reckoning of the scientists who study it, should have been all but impossible. A ridge of high pressure built over the region, and it was not an ordinary ridge. It was a monster, one of the most intense and anomalous heat domes ever recorded anywhere on Earth, and it parked itself directly over the Pacific Northwest with the same fundamental architecture we have been describing throughout this video. The same sinking, compressing air, the same trapping lid, the same offshore flow erasing the ocean's cooling, the same block refusing to move. Everything we have walked through, the entire machine, assembled over this region in late June 2021, and then it turned itself up to a level no one had prepared for. What makes this so important for understanding this weekend is the calendar and the geography. It was the same time of year, the back half of June, and the same place, the same coastline, the same valleys, the same cities. The setup that is forming right now is recognisably from the same family as the setup that formed then: an amplified offshore ridge, a thermally induced trough, downslope offshore flow, and a population caught early in the season before acclimatization. This is precisely why the forecasters and the scientists are paying such close attention. It is not that this weekend will necessarily match 2021. On the current outlook, it will not come close to those extremes. It is that the pattern, the underlying machine, is the same one, reassembling on the same schedule over the same ground. The thing that should be rare is showing its face again. In 2021, the machine reached a level that broke the imagination of the people watching it. To understand just how far outside the normal range it went, you have to understand what a temperature record actually means in a place with a long history of measurements. Records, especially all-time records, usually fall by a fraction of a degree or a single degree after standing for decades. That is the normal rhythm of a warming but still recognizable climate. What happened in 2021 was not that. The records did not inch upward. They were shattered, obliterated, beaten by margins so large that the statisticians who later analysed the event struggled to even assign it a probability. The atmosphere did not nudge past its previous limits. It leapt past them. To grasp how far outside the expected range that event sat, it helps to know that scientists measure these things not just in degrees, but in the strength of the high-pressure ridge itself, the height of the pressure surfaces in the upper atmosphere. By that measure, the ridge that built over the Pacific Northwest in 2021 was one of the most extreme ever observed at that latitude, an anomaly so far beyond the normal range that, in the language of statistics, it was a multi-sigma event, the kind of departure from average that is supposed to be vanishingly rare. The strength of the dome aloft matched the impossibility of the temperatures below it. This was not an ordinary strong ridge having a bad week. It was a structure near the theoretical ceiling of what that part of the atmosphere was thought capable of producing. That extremity sparked a genuine and ongoing debate among scientists, one worth understanding because it bears directly on the question this whole video is circling. One camp argued that the event, however shocking, was essentially the loaded dice doing exactly what loaded dice do, an extreme but explicable draw from a distribution that warming has shifted toward heat, the rare tail event that becomes possible when the whole curve slides over. Another camp suggested something more unsettling, that the event may have involved a nonlinear amplification, some process by which the warming did not just shift the odds, but actively enabled a feedback that pushed the dome to an intensity beyond what the simple statistics would predict, a so-called black swan that the models did not see coming and may not fully capture. The distinction matters enormously. If the first camp is right, these events are rare but boundable. If the second is right, the atmosphere may have ways of producing extremes that our predictions systematically underestimate, which would mean the worst case is worse than we think. The debate is not settled. But notice that under either interpretation, the conclusion points the same uncomfortable direction, toward a pattern capable of more than we assumed, reassembling over the same ground this weekend. And it did so in a way that revealed something genuinely frightening about the system. The heat did not arrive all at once. It built day by day exactly as the machine dictates. Each day broke the record set the day before. The dome held, the heat compounded, the nights refused to cool, and the numbers climbed into territory that simply had no precedent in the entire instrumental history of the region. This was the persistence we have been talking about, taken to its absolute extreme. Not one terrible day, but a sequence of escalating terrible days, each one building on a population and an infrastructure that had no slack left from the day before. The same mechanism that threatens the region this weekend, in a milder form, is the mechanism that, in 2021, ran past every safeguard and every expectation the Pacific Northwest had. I want to be precise about why this comparison is fair and not alarmist, because that distinction is everything. I am not telling you this weekend will be 2021. The forecast does not support that, and it would be dishonest to imply it. What I am telling you is that 2021 is the proof of what this kind of pattern can do when it reaches its full potential. The demonstrated worst case sitting at the top of the same ladder, this weekend's event is climbing. When you watch a familiar machine begin to assemble, it is only rational to remember the last time that machine ran at full power. The setup this weekend is the same species of event. It is simply, on current forecasts, a far smaller member of that species, and the gap between a small member and a monstrous one comes down to factors: the exact intensity of the ridge, the precise configuration of the flow that the atmosphere does not always reveal until it is upon us. So how far did it actually go that summer? What were the numbers that broke the records and broke the imagination, and what did they do to the people underneath them? Because the abstraction of a shattered record only becomes real when you attach it to a thermometer reading and to a human cost. The numbers from 2021 are almost difficult to believe, and they are the clearest possible measure of what the sky over the Pacific Northwest is capable of when this pattern reaches its peak. Let me show you exactly what the atmosphere did. Part 9. The numbers that should not be possible. The city of Portland, Oregon has been keeping temperature records since the late 1800s, well over a century of careful measurement. In all those decades, through every summer the region had ever known, the hottest the city had ever recorded was around 107 degrees Fahrenheit. That was the ceiling, the established limit of what the Portland sky could do, a number that had stood as the extreme for as long as anyone had been writing it down. Then came the final days of June 2021. On the first day of the heat dome's peak, Portland reached 108 degrees, edging past its all-time record. That alone would have been a notable event. But the dome was just getting started. The next day, Portland hit 112 degrees, and the day after that, on June 28, 2021, the temperature in Portland, Oregon climbed to 116 degrees Fahrenheit. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is hard to overstate how extraordinary it is. 116 degrees did not just break the old record of around 107. It demolished it, by roughly 9 degrees, over the span of 3 consecutive days, each hotter than the last. To put that in perspective, breaking an all-time temperature record by 9 degrees is, statistically, almost incomprehensible. It is the kind of margin that should not appear in a stable climate even once in many thousands of years. Portland, a temperate city famous for its mild grey summers, recorded a temperature that would be punishing in Phoenix. The same machine that is assembling over the region this weekend, when it ran at full power in 2021, produced a reading that rewrote the absolute limit of what that city's sky could do. Seattle told the same story. The city, sitting right on the cool waters of Puget Sound, with a climate so mild that air conditioning was historically rare even by Northwest standards, reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit on that same brutal June day, its highest temperature ever recorded. For a city like Seattle, 108 degrees is almost surreal, a number so far outside its lived experience that the infrastructure, the housing, and the people had no framework for it. Roads buckled, power cables melted. The physical fabric of cities designed for a maritime climate began, in places, to literally come apart under temperatures they were never built to face. And then there is Lytton. To understand the full reach of that 2021 event, you have to follow the dome north, across the border into British Columbia, to a small village called Lytton sitting in a river canyon. On June 29, 2021, Lytton recorded a temperature of 121.3 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 49.6 degrees Celsius. That reading did not just set a record for the town or the province, it set the highest temperature ever recorded in the entire country of Canada, a nation most of the world associates with cold. A village in Canada recorded a temperature hotter than most days in Las Vegas or Death Valley in peak summer. And the story of Lytton does not end with the number. The very next day, June 30th, with the surrounding terrain baked to tinder by the heat, A wildfire swept through the village and destroyed most of it. The town that had just recorded the hottest temperature in Canadian history was, within 24 hours, largely burned to the ground. It is a sequence so stark it almost reads like a parable, the heat record and the fire arriving back to back, the dome and the flame. What ties these numbers together, and what makes them so unsettling rather than just impressive, is that they did not happen in isolated spots. They happened everywhere under the dome all at once. It was not that one unlucky town caught a freak reading while its neighbours stayed normal. Records fell across an entire region simultaneously, hundreds of them, city after city after city posting all-time highs over the same few days, because the machine producing them was continental in scale. When you see a single record broken, you can wonder about a faulty sensor or a strange local quirk. When you see hundreds of records broken across an entire region in the same window, each one confirming the others, the explanation can only be a single enormous structure imposing itself on the whole area. That is exactly what a heat dome is, and that is exactly what the readings documented. The scale of the agreement among all those thermometers is itself the proof of what was overhead. To feel the full strangeness of these numbers, set them next to the places we associate with extreme heat. 116 degrees, the reading Portland posted, is a temperature you would expect from Phoenix or Las Vegas, at the worst of their summer, desert cities built around that kind of heat. Portland is a temperate green river city whose summers are normally so gentle that air conditioning was historically optional. For it to record a desert temperature is roughly as incongruous as a snowstorm in the tropics. And Lytton's reading of 121.3 degrees would be a severe day even in Death Valley, one of the hottest places on the surface of the planet, yet it was set in a river canyon in Canada, a country most of the world pictures under snow. These were not simply hot days for the region. They were readings that did not belong to the region's climate at all, numbers borrowed from the harshest deserts on Earth and dropped onto temperate ground. That is the measure of how far the same machine now reassembling over the Pacific Northwest pushed the atmosphere when it ran at full power. There is one more thing these numbers did, quietly, that matters for every forecast issued in the region from that point forward. They redefined the worst case. Before 2021, if you had asked a forecaster what the absolute ceiling was for a Portland heatwave, the honest answer would have been somewhere around that old record of 107 degrees, because that was the most the atmosphere had ever shown itself capable of there. After 2021, that ceiling no longer exists because the atmosphere demonstrated it could reach 116. The upper bound of the imaginable shifted by nearly 10 degrees in a single event. And once a worst case has actually happened, it can never again be dismissed as impossible. Every forecaster now watching this weekend's ridge knows, in a way their predecessors did not, that the regional sky is capable of numbers that used to belong only to nightmares and deserts. That knowledge is built into the caution in their language. When they hedge, when they warn, when they reach for the most serious products in their toolkit over temperatures in the 90s, it is because they have seen what the gentler-looking version of this pattern can grow into, and they are no longer willing to assume it cannot happen again. The records of 2021 are not just history. They are the new measure of what this same machine, the one forming overhead right now, is capable of becoming. These numbers matter for this weekend not because we expect to see them again, but because they define the ceiling of the pattern. They are the answer to the question, how bad can this machine get? And the answer is, far worse than anyone in the Pacific Northwest had ever imagined before it happened. Every forecast this weekend, every warning the Portland and Seattle offices issue, is being written by people who lived through 2021, who watched a temperate region record temperatures that belonged in a desert, who saw a Canadian village hit 121 degrees and then burn. When they use the word likely about records this weekend, they are using it with the memory of what likely became last time fresh in their minds. The same pattern that produced those impossible numbers is, in a gentler form, the pattern forming right now. But numbers on a thermometer, however shocking, are still just numbers. A temperature record is an abstraction until you understand what it did to the people living underneath it. 116 degrees in Portland is a statistic. The human consequence of that statistic, the reason this event is remembered not as a curiosity but as a catastrophe, is something far heavier. Because while the records were falling and the headlines were marvelling at the numbers, the same heat was moving quietly through homes and apartments and care facilities across the region, finding the vulnerable, stealing their nights, and in the end taking a toll that the early counts badly underestimated. To understand why this pattern deserves the seriousness in this video's title, we have to talk about the cost. Part 10. The cost. The title of this video says the same pattern killed hundreds in 2021, and that is not a figure of speech or an exaggeration for effect. It is a measured fact, and it is, if anything, a conservative way of stating it. When the heat dome of late June 2021 finally broke and the accounting began, the scale of the human loss became one of the defining features of the event, and it was far larger than anyone realized while it was happening. That is the nature of heat, as we have said. It kills quietly, indoors, out of sight, and the bodies are counted later. In the state of Oregon, official tallies attributed roughly 100 deaths to that single heat wave, a staggering number for an event lasting only a few days in a state unaccustomed to heat. In Washington state, the toll was comparable, again on the order of 100 lives, and north of the border in British Columbia the heat dome was even more lethal, with the provincial authorities ultimately linking around 600 deaths to the event. Add those figures together across the region the dome covered, and the combined toll runs well into the hundreds, with broader estimates that account for the full excess mortality, all the deaths above what would normally be expected in that period, pushing the regional total toward the vicinity of 1,400 people. Whether you take the narrow official counts or the wider excess mortality estimates, the conclusion is the same. This was a mass casualty event, one of the deadliest weather disasters in the modern history of the Pacific Northwest, and it was caused by exactly the kind of atmospheric pattern that is reassembling over the region this weekend. Who were these people? They were, overwhelmingly, the vulnerable population we described earlier, and their stories follow the grim logic of how heat kills. They were disproportionately elderly. They were disproportionately people living alone, with no one present to notice when they began to fail. Many of them died in their own homes, homes without air conditioning, homes that had absorbed days of heat and held it through nights that never cooled. Many had underlying health conditions that the relentless heat stress pushed past the breaking point. They did not die dramatically in the noonday sun. They died the way heat actually kills, slowly, over days, as their bodies were denied the recovery that the warm night stole until the most fragile systems gave out. The machine we built earlier in this video, the dome and the trapped heat and the stolen nights, was not an abstraction for these hundreds of people. It was the direct cause of their deaths. It is worth understanding how we even know the toll was this high, because the counting itself reveals something about how heat hides its victims. The early official death counts in the days right after the event were far lower than the final numbers, because in the immediate aftermath a death gets recorded by its proximate medical cause, a cardiac event, organ failure, a collapse, with no obvious label tying it to the weather. The true scale only emerges later, through a method called excess mortality, in which statisticians compare the number of people who died during the event to the number who would normally be expected to die in that same region during that same stretch of the calendar. The gap between the two, all the deaths above the normal baseline, is the real fingerprint of the disaster, and it is almost always far larger than the early counts suggest. This is why heat is so consistently underestimated. By the time the full toll is understood, the headlines have moved on, and the hundreds of quiet deaths never get the attention that a single dramatic disaster would command. The aftermath of 2021 did change things, and that matters for this weekend, because it is the reason the region is at least somewhat better defended now. The shock of that event forced a reckoning. Air conditioning adoption climbed. Cities built out networks of cooling centres and made real plans to open them quickly. Outreach programs were created to check on the elderly and the isolated during heat events. Public awareness rose, so that fewer people now treat a severe heat forecast as nothing to worry about. Programs emerged to help low-income households afford cooling. None of this makes the region heat-proof, and the deepest vulnerability, the building stock and the uneven distribution of cooling, remains. But it does mean that the same pattern, arriving this weekend in a milder form, meets a population that has, at painful cost, learned to take it seriously. The hundreds who died in 2021 did not die for nothing, if the lessons their deaths taught are actually applied when the sky does this again. And the sky is doing it again, right now, which is exactly why those lessons are about to be tested. And here is the finding that elevates this from a regional tragedy into something with global weight. after the event, an international team of climate scientists conducted what is called an attribution study, a rigorous statistical analysis designed to answer a specific question. How likely was this event, and what role did the warming climate play in it? Their conclusion was stark. They found that the 2021 Pacific Northwest heat dome would have been, in their words, virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. In the climate of the present day, already warmed, they estimated the event was on the order of a 1 in 1,000 year occurrence, meaning that even now, with the dice already loaded toward heat, a dome that extreme should appear at a given location only about once in a millennium. Without the warming, it would have been rarer still by a wide margin. This was not a normal heat wave. It was an outlier so extreme that it sat at the very edge of what scientists believed the atmosphere could produce. That phrase, 1 in 1,000 years, is where this whole story turns from history into something genuinely unsettling, and it deserves careful thought. A 1 in 1,000 year event is supposed to be the kind of thing that happens, by definition, about once every 1,000 years. It is supposed to be a freak, a once in many lifetimes catastrophe. And yet here we are, 5 years later, watching the same fundamental pattern reassemble over the same region, in the same stretch of the calendar. Now, to be clear and fair, this weekend's event is nowhere near the magnitude of that 1 in 1,000 year monster. It is a far smaller member of the same family. The forming pattern is the same species, but a much gentler specimen. So this weekend, on its own, is not evidence that the 1,000-year event has become common. But it raises the question that sits underneath this entire video, the question that the title is really pointing at. If a pattern this extreme is supposed to be a once-in-a-millennium event, why does the machine that produces it keep showing up? Why has the same configuration assembled over the same region, on the same schedule, again, just 5 years after it killed hundreds of people? Is it pure chance, a coincidence of timing that means nothing? Or is something about the atmosphere itself changing in a way that makes these blocking patterns more frequent, more stubborn, and more likely to find their way to dangerous extremes? To answer that, we have to leave the surface entirely and go up to the level where the whole game is decided, to the great river of air that steers the weather of the planet, and to the question of what happens when that river stops moving. Part 11. The river in the sky that stopped moving. High above your head, far above the clouds and the weather you experience day to day, there is a river. It is a river of air, not water, but in almost every way that matters it behaves like one. It is called the jet stream, a ribbon of fast-moving wind that circles the entire hemisphere, flowing generally from west to east, separating the cold air of the polar regions from the warm air of the tropics. The jet stream is the great steering current of the atmosphere. It is the thing that pushes weather systems along, that carries storms across the continent, that determines whether a given week is hot or cold, wet or dry. And the behavior of this river, whether it flows fast and straight or slow and wandering, is the hidden hand behind nearly every extreme weather event you have ever heard of, including the heat dome forming over the Pacific Northwest right now. When the jet stream is strong and relatively straight, it acts like a brisk current, sweeping weather systems through quickly. A hot spell builds, but the jet shoves it along within a day or two, and conditions reset. This is the healthy, mobile state of the atmosphere, and it is the enemy of heat domes, because heat domes need time to build their lethal heat, and a fast jet stream does not give them that time. But the jet stream does not always flow fast and straight. Sometimes it slows down, and when it slows, it begins to meander, to wander north and south in great looping waves instead of running clean from west to east. These waves have a name. They are called Rossby waves, after the scientist who first described them, and they are the planetary scale undulations of the jet stream, the giant curves that send warm air surging north in some places and cold air plunging south in others. Now here is the part that matters for heat domes. When those Rossby waves grow especially large, when the jet stream develops big exaggerated loops, something dangerous can happen. The waves can stall. They can stop progressing eastward and lock into place, freezing the pattern. And when a northward bulge of the jet stream, a ridge, gets stuck like that, the dome of high pressure underneath it gets stuck too. This is the blocking pattern, the omega block we described at the very beginning, seen now from above. The block is not some separate phenomenon. It is what happens when the river in the sky stops moving, and a loop in it freezes in place. The heat dome over the Pacific Northwest this weekend exists because a wave in the jet stream is parking a ridge over the region, and the same was true, far more violently, in 2021. Scientists have a name for the most extreme version of this stalling, a process sometimes described as quasi-resonant amplification. The details are technical, but the core idea is intuitive enough. Under certain conditions, the waves in the jet stream can fall into a kind of resonance, like a guitar string vibrating at just the right frequency, and when they do, the waves grow unusually large and lock in unusually hard. The result is a pattern that is both more extreme and more stubborn than usual, a ridge that pumps up higher and sits longer. When researchers look at some of the most severe heat waves of recent decades around the world, they often find this kind of amplified, stalled wave pattern behind them. The persistence we keep coming back to, the days on end of trapped building heat, traces directly to a jet stream that has stopped flowing and locked a giant loop into place. The geometry of these waves has a logic that is worth a moment, because it reveals something surprising about how connected distant disasters can be. The jet stream's meanders come in a certain number of waves wrapped around the hemisphere, and when the pattern stalls, every part of that frozen wave gets locked at once. A northward bulge, a ridge, parks over one region and bakes it under a heat dome. But that same frozen wave has a southward dip, a trough, somewhere downstream, and under that trough you get the opposite extreme, cool air plunging south, storm systems stalling, rain falling and falling over the same ground for days. The heat and the flood are produced by the same stuck wave, at different points along its length. The most vivid demonstration of this came in that 2010 event we mentioned. The same stalled jet stream pattern that gave Russia its catastrophic, record-breaking heat, and wildfires also, at the very same time, parked a relentless trough over South Asia, producing the Pakistan floods that submerged a fifth of that country and displaced millions. One frozen wave, two opposite catastrophes, thousands of miles apart unfolding simultaneously. That is the signature of a blocked amplified jet stream, and it is why these patterns produce not just isolated heat, but bizarre combinations of extremes across whole hemispheres at once. This is also why, when you look at a weather map during one of these episodes, you so often see a strange symmetry. Heat in one place and unseasonable cold or deluge in another, all at the same time. It is not a coincidence, and it is not the weather being random. It is a single, large, stalled wave imposing its shape on the whole continent or hemisphere, holding each region hostage to whichever part of the wave happens to sit overhead. The heat dome forming over the Pacific Northwest this weekend is one bulge in exactly this kind of pattern, and as we'll see, the simultaneous heat gripping other parts of the country at the same time is the rest of that same frozen wave showing its hand. The question that follows naturally is the one that has been building under this entire discussion. What determines how often the jet stream falls into this stuck, amplified state in the first place, and is that frequency changing? And this is where the question at the centre of this video gets its teeth. If heat domes are produced by stalled, amplified waves in the jet stream, then the frequency of dangerous heat domes depends on how often the jet stream falls into that stalled, amplified state. And that in turn depends on the large-scale condition of the atmosphere, on the temperature differences and the energy balance that govern how the jet stream behaves. So the real question is not just about this weekend, or even about 2021. It is about whether the conditions that make the jet stream wander, stall and lock are becoming more common. It is about whether the river in the sky is changing its behaviour in a way that makes these blocks, and the deadly domes beneath them, more likely to form and more likely to stick. This is one of the most actively debated questions in atmospheric science right now, and I want to handle it honestly, because honesty is the whole point. There is no simple, settled answer that everyone agrees on. But there is a leading hypothesis, a candidate explanation, that connects the wandering of the jet stream to one of the most dramatic changes happening anywhere on the planet. A change unfolding far to the north, in the Arctic. The idea is that what is happening at the top of the world may be reaching down to reshape the river of air that steers the weather over the Pacific Northwest. And whether or not that hypothesis turns out to be the full answer, the connection it draws is worth understanding, because it is the most compelling attempt yet to explain why the same pattern keeps coming back. Part 12. The Arctic Connection. To understand the leading idea about why the jet stream may be wandering and stalling more often, you have to understand what powers the jet stream in the first place. The jet stream exists because of a temperature difference. specifically the difference in temperature between the cold air of the Arctic and the warmer air of the middle latitudes. That contrast, that gradient between cold north and warm south, is the engine that drives the river of air. The bigger the temperature difference, the stronger and tighter and faster the jet stream tends to run. It is the thermal contrast that gives the river its current. And this is where one of the most significant facts about the modern planet enters the story. The Arctic is warming faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. This is one of the most robustly observed features of the changing climate, sometimes called Arctic amplification. As the planet warms overall, the far north is warming at a rate several times the global average. As sea ice retreats, and the dark open ocean absorbs heat that bright ice used to reflect away. The consequence is that the Arctic, the cold end of the jet stream's engine, is heating up more quickly than the middle latitudes, the warm end. And if the cold end warms faster than the warm end, then the temperature difference between them, the gradient that drives the jet stream, gets smaller. The hypothesis, associated most prominently with the work of the atmospheric scientist Jennifer Francis and a number of colleagues, runs like this. As the temperature contrast between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes weakens, the jet stream weakens too, and a weaker jet stream, the argument goes, is a wavier, slower, lazier jet stream, one more prone to developing those big meandering Rossby wave loops, and more prone to having those loops stall and lock in place. In other words, a warming Arctic may be loosening the river in the sky, making it wander more, making it stall more, and therefore making blocking patterns, and the heat domes they produce, more frequent and more persistent. If that hypothesis is correct, then the answer to why the same pattern keeps coming back is, in part, that we have changed the machinery of the jet stream itself, and the stalled blocks that produce killer heat domes are becoming a more regular feature of the atmosphere we live under. Now, I promised honesty, and honesty requires me to tell you clearly that this hypothesis is contested. It is not settled science. It is a serious, prominent, and actively researched idea, but it is the subject of real and legitimate scientific debate. Some studies support a connection between Arctic warming and more frequent jet stream stalling. Others find the relationship weak or inconsistent, or swamped by the natural chaos of the atmosphere, which produces wandering jet streams and blocking patterns all on its own and always has. Let me lay out the disagreement fairly, because it is a genuinely instructive example of how careful science wrestles with a hard question. The part that nobody disputes is the change in the Arctic itself. The summer sea ice has been in clear, measured decline for decades, with the late summer minimum extent down very roughly 40% from where it sat at the start of the satellite record, and the Arctic warming at something like 3 to 4 times the global rate. That much is settled, observed, and not seriously contested. The fight is over what that warming does to the jet stream. The scientists who developed the hypothesis point to the basic physics of the temperature gradient and to specific cases where blocking patterns followed unusual Arctic warmth. Their critics point out that the jet stream is influenced by many things at once, that natural year-to-year variability is enormous, that the statistical signal connecting Arctic warming to mid-latitude blocking is hard to isolate cleanly, and sometimes vanishes when the data is sliced differently, and that some climate models do not reproduce the proposed effect at all. What makes this so hard to resolve is that everyone is trying to detect a possible trend in a system that is wildly noisy to begin with. The atmosphere has always thrown the occasional stuck ridge and the occasional brutal heat wave, long before any human influence, simply through its own internal chaos. So the question is not whether blocking patterns exist, they always have, but whether they are becoming meaningfully more frequent or more persistent, and whether the warming Arctic is the reason. Pulling a modest signal out of that much natural noise takes long records and careful statistics, and reasonable scientists genuinely disagree about what the data show so far. There is an important distinction hiding inside all of this that is worth making explicit. The thermodynamic part of the story, the simple fact that a warmer world makes any given heatwave hotter, is on extremely solid ground. The dynamic part, the claim that warming is changing the behavior of the jet stream to produce more blocking in the first place, is the genuinely uncertain frontier. I want you to hold both of those in your mind at once, the near certainty of the first and the honest uncertainty of the second, because together they frame exactly how much we can and cannot say about why the same pattern keeps returning to the Pacific Northwest. The atmosphere is a fantastically complex system, and pulling a single clean cause and effect signal out of it is genuinely difficult. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you that the warming Arctic is definitively the reason a heat dome is forming over the Pacific Northwest this weekend. That would be overstating what the science currently supports, and the goal of this channel is to respect the evidence, not to bend it for a better story. What I can tell you is that this is the leading mechanistic candidate for the unease that so many people, including scientists, feel when they watch the same extreme pattern reassemble over the same region just 5 years after it killed hundreds. It offers a physical reason, grounded in the basic engine of the jet stream, for why these blocks might be growing more common, and it connects a change we can measure directly, the rapid warming of the Arctic, to a change in the behaviour of the river of air that steers our weather. Even held at the appropriate distance, even labelled clearly as a hypothesis rather than a settled fact, it is a sobering line of reasoning because it suggests that the machinery producing these domes may be shifting in a direction that favours them. But there is a second factor at work, one that is far less contested, far more solidly established, and that operates regardless of whatever the jet stream is doing. It does not require any argument about Arctic amplification or stalled Rossby waves. It is simpler, more direct, and in some ways more inescapable. It is the fact that the entire atmosphere, the whole canvas on which these patterns play out, is warmer than it used to be. And when the baseline itself rises, the mathematics of extreme heat changes in a way that loads the dice toward exactly the kind of record-breaking events we keep seeing. To understand the full picture of why the same pattern keeps coming back, we have to look at the loaded dice. Part 13. The loaded dice. Imagine the range of possible temperatures for a given place and time of year as a bell curve. In the middle, the most common outcomes, the ordinary days. Out at the right-hand edge, the rare extremes, the record-breaking heat. For most of human history, that curve has been roughly stable, anchored in place, so that the extreme right-hand tail, the truly dangerous heat, stayed where it had always been. Now picture what happens when you take that entire curve and slide it, just a little, to the warmer side. You do not have to move it far. Shift the whole distribution by a degree or two, and something happens out at the edges that is far more dramatic than the small shift in the middle. The temperatures that used to sit at the extreme tail, the once-in-a-generation readings, are now reached more easily and more often, and entirely new extremes, readings that used to lie beyond the edge of the curve, beyond what was physically on the table, suddenly become possible for the first time. This is the loaded dice, and it is one of the most important and least intuitive ideas in all of climate science. The global average temperature of the planet is now roughly 1.2 to 1.3 degrees Celsius above where it sat before the industrial era. In Fahrenheit terms, that is a little over 2 degrees of warming in the global average. That might sound almost trivial. 2 degrees, who would even notice? But the global average is a deceptive number because it smooths out everything. The warming is not felt as a uniform, gentle 2 degrees everywhere. It is felt at the edges, in the extremes, where that shifted curve does its damage. Every heat wave now begins from a higher starting point, a warmer baseline, so that the same atmospheric pattern, the same stalled ridge, the same heat dome, builds to a higher peak than it would have a century ago. The machine has not changed, but the floor it operates on has been raised, and when you raise the floor, the ceiling goes up with it. This is the factor that operates no matter what you believe about the jet stream debate. Even if the Arctic amplification hypothesis turned out to be entirely wrong, even if blocking patterns were no more frequent than they have ever been, the simple fact of a warmer baseline would still mean that when a heat dome does form, it reaches more dangerous extremes than the same dome would have reached in a cooler world. The dice are loaded. The same roll that used to produce a hot summer day now has a real chance of producing a record. The same pattern that killed hundreds in 2021 was operating on this raised floor, which is part of why it reached numbers that should have been impossible. And the pattern forming this weekend is operating on that same raised floor too. The baseline warming does not create the heat dome. It makes every heat dome more dangerous than it would otherwise be. This is exactly the kind of question that a field of science called attribution has been built to answer, and the way it works is worth understanding, because it is how researchers were able to say what they did about 2021. When an extreme event happens, attribution scientists run climate models many thousands of times, simulating two different worlds. One is the world as it actually is, with the warming humans have added. The other is a counterfactual world, identical except that the human-caused warming is removed. They then compare how often, and how intensely, the extreme event shows up in each world. If a heat wave of a given severity appears far more frequently in the real, warmed world than in the cooler counterfactual, that difference is the fingerprint of human influence, expressed as a number. This is how the team studying the 2021 event could conclude that it would have been virtually impossible without the warming, and that even now it sits at the edge of what is possible. It is not guesswork or hand-waving. It is a structured, repeatable method for separating the roll of the dice from the loading of the dice. And when you step back and look at the broader statistics, the loaded dice show up everywhere, not just in single spectacular events. Across long climate records, the ratio of record high temperatures to record low temperatures has been climbing steadily. In a stable climate, you would expect them to roughly balance, about as many new record lows as record highs over time. Instead, record highs have been increasingly outnumbering record lows year after year, decade after decade, which is precisely the footprint you would expect from a whole distribution shifting toward the warm side. The string of years recently logged as the hottest in the global instrumental record tells the same story from another angle. None of this requires any single event to be unprecedented. It is the accumulation, the steady tilt of the odds, that reveals the loaded dice at work. The heat dome forming over the Pacific Northwest this weekend is one roll. The pattern in all those records is the loading. And it is the loading, far more than any single roll, that explains why the same kind of extreme keeps appearing more often than it used to. There is a way to see this loaded dice effect at work in the broader picture this very week, and it widens the lens beyond the Pacific Northwest. The heat dome forming over the Northwest is not happening in isolation. Across the country at the same time, the desert Southwest is running into the 110-degree range, and California's Central Valley into the hundreds. On the other side of the continent, the eastern states have been baking under their own near-record heat, with heat index values climbing past 100 degrees before a cold front pushes that heat back out over the weekend. What you're looking at is a single, amplified wave pattern draped across the entire continent, producing heat on the west coast and the east coast at nearly the same time, separated by a transient dip in between. It is the same wavy, stalled jet stream we have been describing, written large across the whole map. The Pacific Northwest Dome is one node in a continental scale pattern, and the simultaneity of all that heat is itself a fingerprint of a jet stream, locked into big, slow, amplified loops. Think back to what we said about the frozen wave, the stalled jet stream that holds every part of its shape in place at once. That is precisely what you are watching unfold across the country right now. The same large, sluggish wave pattern that is building the ridge over the Pacific Northwest is, at the same moment, pinning extreme heat over the desert Southwest and feeding the near-record warmth that has been baking the eastern states. These are not separate weather events that happen to be occurring at the same time by chance. They are different points along one enormous stuck wave draped across the continent, each region held under whichever part of the wave sits overhead. The transient cooler dip that slides between the coasts, the cold front that pushes the eastern heat out over the weekend, is simply the trough of that same wave passing through. When you pull back far enough to see the whole map at once, the pattern resolves into a single coherent structure, and the heat over the Pacific Northwest stops looking like a local anomaly and starts looking like exactly what it is, one bulge in a hemisphere-scale wave that has slowed down and dug in. This wider view is what gives the loaded dice their full weight, because it shows the same warmed baseline lifting the extremes everywhere at once, not just in one unlucky region. A continent simultaneously running hot in multiple places separated by a single cool notch is the visible signature of an atmosphere whose whole distribution has shifted upward, while its steering current has grown more prone to stalling. The Pacific Northwest event is the part of this picture with the most dangerous local consequences, because of everything we have said about the region's vulnerability, but it is not happening alone. It is the most acute symptom of a broader condition, and that broader condition is the real subject underneath this entire video. The question of why the same kinds of extremes keep showing up in more places, more often, than the climate of memory would ever have allowed. I want to add one important clarification, because it cuts against a common assumption, and it is the kind of distinction this channel exists to make. You might naturally assume that a summer with this much heat must be an El Niño year, one of those periodic warm phases of the Pacific Ocean that tend to spike global temperatures. But that is not what is driving this. The current state of that Pacific climate pattern is neutral, neither a strong El Niño nor a La Niña, sitting just barely on the warm side of neutral. This matters because it means you cannot wave away this weekend's heat, or the broader pattern, as just an El Niño spike that will pass when the ocean flips. The driver here is the atmospheric blocking pattern sitting on top of the elevated baseline, not a temporary ocean oscillation. The dice are loaded by the long-term warming, and the heat dome is rolling them, with no help needed from El Niño at all. That is, in its own quiet way, a more sobering fact than if this was simply an El Niño year, because it removes the easy reassurance that conditions will reset when the ocean phase changes. So we now have the full machinery of the answer to why the same pattern keeps coming back. A jet stream that may be wandering and stalling more readily, possibly connected to a rapidly warming Arctic, though that part remains debated. And underneath it, beyond debate, a warmer baseline that loads the dice so that every heat dome that does form reaches further into dangerous territory than it once would have. Put those together and you have at least a coherent, physically grounded reason why a once-in-a-thousand-year pattern might be making more frequent appearances, and why the people who study the sky feel a particular unease watching this weekend's ridge assemble. But before we close, I have to address the other explanations, the ones that circulate online whenever an event like this appears, the theories that say this heat is not natural at all, but manufactured, engineered, deliberately inflicted. Because those ideas deserve a direct and honest answer, and answering them properly actually sharpens our understanding of what is really happening. We have to separate what this is from what it is not. Part 14. What this is and what it is not. Whenever an extreme heat event makes the news, a familiar set of alternative explanations rises alongside it, and it would be a failure of this channel to pretend they do not exist, or to dismiss the people who raise them with contempt. The instinct behind them is understandable. When something feels wrong, when the weather seems to behave in ways that break with what you grew up expecting, it is human to suspect a hidden hand. So let me take the most common of these ideas seriously enough to actually examine them, because the physics gives a clear answer, and walking through that answer tells us something true about the scale of what we're dealing with. The most persistent claim is that heat waves like this are deliberately engineered, manufactured by some program of weather modification, whether through the facility often referred to by the acronym HARP, or through aircraft trails in the sky, or through some other form of covert geoengineering. The decisive response to this is not political, and it is not a matter of trust. It is a matter of energy and scale. A continental heat dome is one of the largest energy structures the atmosphere produces. The amount of energy bound up in a blocking ridge that spans hundreds upon hundreds of miles and reaches tens of thousands of feet into the sky is so enormous that it dwarfs, by many orders of magnitude, the entire energy output of any human technology that could plausibly be aimed at the weather. The facility people point to studies the upper atmosphere, the ionosphere, hundreds of miles up, and its total power is a rounding error next to the energy of a single thunderstorm, let alone a continental ridge. There is no technology on Earth, secret or otherwise, that can assemble or steer a structure of that magnitude. The dome is built by the planet's own absorbed sunlight, redistributed by a jet stream the size of a hemisphere. Nothing humans have built operates on that scale. The claim about aircraft trails falls apart for the same fundamental reason. Those trails are condensed water vapor, and while they do have a small, genuine, and well-studied effect on the climate at the margins, they cannot build a blocking ridge or anchor a heat dome in place. The pattern is set thousands of feet above where those trails form, by the planetary scale flow of the jet stream, and no amount of material spread by aircraft has the energy to organize that flow. Then there is the idea that the sun itself is the secret driver, that some change in solar output is cooking the planet. But the sun's energy output varies only by about 0.1% across its natural cycle, far too little to account for the pattern of warming we observe, and the timing of these blocking events does not track the solar cycle at all. The sun is not behaving unusually. The atmosphere is. I want to pause on the deeper reason these theories appeal to people, because dismissing them without understanding them is its own kind of failure. When the weather starts doing things that break with a lifetime of expectations, when a region famous for its cool grey summers suddenly faces an extreme heat warning, the mind reaches for an agent, someone or something doing this on purpose. A deliberate cause, however sinister, can feel strangely more bearable than the alternative, which is that the system we all depend on is shifting in ways that no one is steering and no one can simply switch off. The conspiracy is, in a sense, a comfort, because it implies a hand on a lever that could be stopped. The reality is harder because it asks us to accept a slow, diffuse, unglamorous cause, the gradual warming of an entire planet, with no villain to blame and no switch to flip. I understand the pull of the simpler story, but the evidence does not support it, and pretending otherwise would not serve you. And here is the strongest possible answer to the idea that the people issuing these warnings cannot be trusted or do not know what they are doing. In 2021, the forecasters saw that catastrophe coming. Days in advance, the same Weather Service officers now watching this weekend's ridge were warning clearly and publicly that an unprecedented and dangerous heat event was about to unfold, and they were right, in detail, about a pattern with no precedent to guide them. The science worked. The models that some people dismiss correctly predicted an event that had never happened before. That is not the track record of a system that is broken or dishonest. It is the track record of a science that, whatever its remaining uncertainties about the jet stream and the Arctic, understands the machinery of these heat domes well enough to see them coming and warn the people in their path. So when those same officers use the word likely about records this weekend, the rational response is not suspicion. It is attention. And then there is the simplest alternative of all, the one that requires no conspiracy. It is the claim that this is just summer, that it has always been this hot, that people are panicking over ordinary weather. This one deserves respect because it is not paranoid, it is just mistaken, and the instrumental record is what corrects it. We have well over a century of careful measurements, and they show, unambiguously, that all-time records are now falling far more often than they are being set on the cold end, that the curve has shifted, that events like 2021 are breaking limits that stood for the entire length of the record. It has not always been this hot. The measurements say so plainly. The same pattern reassembling over the Pacific Northwest is not a figment of overactive worry. It is a documented, measured machine producing documented, measured extremes. There is one more clarification I want to make, not to debunk a conspiracy, but to be precise about the specific danger here, because precision matters. You may have heard about something called the wet bulb temperature, a measure that combines heat and humidity to capture the true limit of what the human body can survive. When the air is both hot and extremely humid, sweat cannot evaporate, the body cannot cool itself, and there is a threshold somewhere around 31 to 35 degrees Celsius on the wet bulb scale, beyond which a healthy person cannot survive for long no matter what they do. That is the nightmare scenario in places like the humid tropics. But the Pacific Northwest heat is not that kind of heat. It is dry heat. The danger here does not come from suffocating humidity. It comes from sheer magnitude, from temperatures far outside what the region is built for, landing on a population without cooling, and from those warm nights that deny the body its recovery. I make this distinction not to minimize the threat, but to define it accurately, because understanding precisely how a danger works is the only way to respect it properly. The Northwest heat kills through dry extremity and stolen nights, not through wet bulb suffocation, and the response has to match the real mechanism. So let us draw it all together, because we have travelled a long way. We started with a warning that should not exist in June. An extreme heat warning hung over one of the coolest, least prepared corners of the country. We climbed into the machine that produces it, the sinking, compressing air of a blocking ridge, the trapping lid, the offshore wind that switches off the ocean's cooling, the stolen nights that do the real killing. We saw why this particular region is so uniquely exposed, and we watched the same machine 5 years ago run at full and terrible power, breaking records by impossible margins and taking hundreds of lives. And then we asked the question the title was really pointing at, why this pattern keeps coming back, and we found at least the outline of an answer in a wandering jet stream and a baseline of warming that loads the dice toward extremes. Here is what I am left with, and I will be honest that it is not a comfortable place to land. This weekend, on its own, is not a catastrophe in the making. The forecast does not support panic, and you should not take any of this as a reason to lie awake in fear. It is a serious, dangerous, early-season heat event that demands real care for the vulnerable and real respect for what the sky is doing, and then, by the middle of next week, it will break, and the ocean air will return, and the region will exhale. That is the near-term truth, and it matters. But the longer truth, the one that lingers after the dome lifts, is the question that will not quite let go. A pattern that is supposed to appear once in 1,000 years killed hundreds of people here 5 years ago. And now the same machine, in gentler form, is assembling over the same ground, on the same week of the calendar, while the floor it operates on rises a little higher every year. The temperature this weekend is not really the story. The story is the pattern, and the pattern is becoming a regular visitor to a place that was never built to receive it. The real question is not how hot it gets this Sunday. The real question is what it means that we are no longer surprised when the same sky does the same thing again, and how many more times it will return before the rarest, deadliest version of it stops being rare at all.